I'm Kelsey Litchfield, and this is the Field Advisor Podcast, where I talk with local experts to unpack the latest agronomy information and research, giving you the knowledge to make informed decisions out in the field. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Field Advisor Podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Litchfield, with Matt Montgomery, one of our soy envoys for the 2025 growing season. You might think Matt Montgomery, that name sounds familiar, Matt. You've been an extension, you've been a pioneer, now you're the Agronomy Education Lead at Beck. So give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, well, first off, it is great to be able to be with you, Kelsey. I really appreciate the invite and love the idea here of being able to serve this year as a soy envoy. And yeah, as far as background goes, yeah, I guess I'm old. That's the first part of it, right? I think about 30 years in the industry now. I stepped into university extension right out of college, so I graduated from Western with a degree in ag. Stepped into my first role just across from my home county. Home county is Mason, and stepped into a role in Fulton County. And then after a few years, moved over to the state capital and worked as what was called a crops educator in that role in that county, in the Sangamon Menard unit it was at that time. And I stayed in the Sangamon County area, Springfield, Petersburg area, until about 2008, and then ran our local office there back in my home county for a while for extension, and stuck around after extension reorganization for about a year and a half, and then moved into industry in 2013 as a sales agronomist, and served as a sales agronomist in the state of Missouri and Western Illinois up to about Peoria. And then in 2017, made a switch over to Pioneer to work as a field agronomist with them, and did that for the last few years, primarily over in Western Illinois. And then here recently, as of November, I became what's called the Agronomy Education Lead for Beck's, and serve the whole company, both as a resource for employees, but also as a resource for customers.
It seems like, Matt, you've always had education as part of your job. Why is that? Is that something you enjoy doing? You found out that you're good at? People told you you're good at? Where'd that kind of come from?
I don't know if originally when I stepped into this field that I thought, oh boy, I want to be on the education side of things. But I'd say that my time in extension probably baked that into my blood pretty well. Our friend Stephanie Porter can tell you that extension has a way of really infusing itself into your blood, and you really get to believing in the mission of it and see the value of education and giving people good, solid recommendations. And yeah, I think after spending almost 20 years with that organization, wanting to make sure that I get folks really good information, do my best job to teach, train, present, became a big part of that. And now it's pretty baked in my blood, and I love it. I would have sworn when I was younger that I would never be a teacher. I think you said you've got a relative that's a teacher, and my folks were teachers, and I said I'd never do it. And then here 30 years later, that's basically what I do.
It's always funny how it turns out that way.
It is.
It?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And there's always something new to learn, right, Matt? I mean,
yeah.
I tell people, specifically soybean management, you've heard it for a while, plant earlier, plant earlier, plant earlier. Okay, I think we've heard that, but now what comes with planting earlier? Soybeans, you're looking at the weed management aspect, seed treatments, like there's a lot more factors than just by throwing it in the ground earlier. So talk about what your kind of soybean management philosophy is.
Yeah, as far as my soybean management philosophy goes, I think when you look at the yield increases that we've seen in beans, there is part of that is genetic, undoubtedly, right? There's been some real work in the industry that's advanced the ball when it comes to yield. But I think the other thing that really happened is that people began to grab a hold of really managing beans like a crop about the same time. And so I think it is kind of that genetics by management kind of thing that's really driven some of those increases that we've seen. And so that attention to the crop, treating it like it's a crop, being passionate about that crop and wanting to do it right. I'd say if I had to paint some kind of broad brushstroke about my underlying philosophy with beans, it would be that it's that I think we got to be very serious about management and almost think about the diligence that we've put into corn, that we do that, and even more so on the bean side.
It's an excellent way to put it. What would you say, you talk about education in a lot of areas. What's your favorite one that's your bread and butter? And I have a
Mm.
feeling you might say disease management, or could I be wrong?
Yeah, I would be very I would be I do like the disease side of things. I think Stephanie would tell you probably the insect side of things in particular becomes an area of passion for me. One of the things that really tripped my trigger when it comes to education is digging in and kind of showing people how stuff works. So you remember there used to be those how stuff works books, right? That always
Yeah.
had pictures of how things work. I really like that kind of thing because I think one of the very important things for us to do when it comes to management, to really do management well, we have to have some kind of basic understanding of why. Why is the recommendation the way it is? Um, that way we can make informed guesses when they're necessary. And so, like for instance, I love doing crazy stuff like drawing out how fungicides work, for instance, or how herbicides work, or how insecticides work, or detailing the life cycle of a pest. And I like to do that a lot of times through drawings, because I think a lot of people are visual learners. And so, yeah, I think one of the things I would say, Kelsey, is that um, I I really think part of what happens in the extension system is you become a really good generalist. And so I probably have passion in a lot of areas at the end of the day. But yeah, I like insects. I do like diseases. I do like the pest management side of things. Do like digging in and kind of showing people how. I like to nerd out and show how people. That's what it's all about, Kelsey. I just like to nerd out. That's really what it comes
Sure,
down to.
sure. Hey, I think it's interesting to ask the why.
Yeah,
Sometimes you get caught up in the research, but really looking at the why,
yeah,
maybe from a holistic point of view, but also maybe from a 30,000 feet point of view to really narrow down what we're talking about. Because there's so much going on in agriculture, it seems like, especially when it comes
yeah,
to agronomy, the precision side to the weed side, like they all kind of interact somehow. And you can't get focused in on one too many things because,
yeah.
as we say, it's a system approach.
And I think we live in this environment where the dollars are tight. There's only a limited number of chips. That's kind of one of my famous phrases, is there's a limited number of chips to be spent. And I think by having some understandings of why a recommendation is the way it is, or how something works, you can begin to make those informed decisions about what you invest in and what you pass on. Because that's honestly right now, that's a big part of this game, is there's a whole lot of things you could do, and what are those things that are most worth your investment, in time and resources, dollars. I think that's why it's really important to dig down into the how and the why.
Mhm, definitely. One thing I wanna bring up is you have a brand, which I think is interesting. So you're the Agronomy Education Lead at Beck's Hybrids, Matt Montgomery, but you're also known as the short, bald agronomist. Where did
Yeah.
that come from? I'm curious
Uh,
the story behind that.
well, you'd be very surprised. I'm short and I'm bald, so those things go into it. But no. A few years ago, I'd heard somebody talk about how we all should be branding ourselves, and I don't know, some of that felt a little bit, man, it felt like a little bit, I don't know, arrogant for me to think of doing that. And so I kind of came up with this brand idea where if I was going to brand myself, I'd point out two really big shortcomings, and those would go into the brand to kind of bring some humility into every post. And it's been kind of fun. Yeah, had a coworker that right after that came with T-shirts, and that's kind of translated into some other things like that. And I probably wouldn't have expected that, but that's become a brand that people recognize. And I'm real honored by
And
that,
that's
and
the
it
purpose of it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're memorable.
yeah, it's you want to make sure. So I talked about teaching, training. Talked about why and how, and you want to have something out there that tells people, hey, listen, you can kind of associate this brand with this kind of quality of information, and that way kind of the information you're going to get with this crazy brand of mine. And then also, maybe it has a way of in the crowd kind of jumping out there and grabbing people's attention. So they pay attention to that stuff that I'm really passionate about. And so it's a brand, but I got to be really clear that I don't make any money off of that brand. When there's t-shirts, I don't get a dime of that, that
Yeah.
goes to a local farm family. So
Oh, that's interesting. So, all the proceeds go somewhere else.
yeah, there's a local family in the area. They have a company called Lily and Lou, and Lily and Lou, that's a farm family, and every dollar that you spend goes to
Mhm.
Lily and Lou. None of there's
That's
no
great.
dollars coming back to Matt Montgomery. It's just my brand, and somebody else gets all the. You do any of the apparel stuff, somebody
Yeah.
else gets that, not me.
That's great. I think it's always good to have a personal brand. As
Yeah,
a communicator, a brand is how someone remembers you,
yeah,
or a legacy, or, however that might work out. But you leave a lasting impression on someone, and that is your brand, whether you have a name for it or not, such as yourself. And um I think that speaks to a lot of what you're doing. And then also, you like to post quizzes on
yeah.
X that people like to participate in. So, how does that feed into the brand?
Yeah, so I try to put the logo on that each time. So I call it the Short Bald Agronomist Ag Quiz, and I throw out questions throughout the season. And part of that too, yes, part of that is for the audience that we would work with, this grower base that we all feel really honored to have some kind of interaction with. It's a nice way to throw out other little tidbits of information that they might want to keep their eye on. The other thing is, and one of the other big purposes that I started doing that is that there's this huge audience out there that has nothing to do with row crop agriculture. And I just want to give them a little sense of how really deep this field is. That sometimes people can kind of write off how complicated an industry this is. And so one of my hopes through those quizzes is that if you're outside of ag, you kind of step back and go, wow, there's a lot more to it than what I realized. And maybe even somebody down the road thinks, man, maybe that's a field I want to participate in, because
Mm.
boy, there's a lot of interesting things I didn't realize fit under this umbrella of row crop agriculture. And so yeah, I do that as well.
Do you do any mentoring, Matt?
I do. I did some formal, please forgive me for that, formal mentoring when I was in Pioneer, and do that now as well. And that's actually part of this position that I've stepped into at
Mm.
Beck's. Is they want me to be an agronomist mentor to maybe other agronomists that are coming in early in their position, which is great. I can't overstate how much I benefited during my extension days from all these really seasoned, amazing veterans in the field, that were very kind to take me under their wing when I was pretty young and pretty green and had a lot to learn, and kind of shepherded me along in this field and in this art of doing agronomy education. And so I kind of really see that as a big thing that I do, and I feel very fortunate. You think about you're putting your fingerprints on the future by doing that.
Yeah. Matt, what are some of those things you learned as a young agronomist that still stick with you to this day?
So this is going to be interesting. This is completely off of the agronomy side, but I remember a really good, great agronomist taking a moment to pull me into his office. The gentleman's name was Bill Brink, and Bill served as a crops educator in our regional center in the Springfield area across the hall from where I worked. And I remember Bill pulling me into his office one day and being very adamant to make sure that he set my focus in life right. And he talked about, young man, there's going to come a day where you lay in a casket and people aren't going to talk about how great an agronomist you were and how many programs you did and all this. They're going to look at the legacy that you left with your family. And that's what people are going to judge you by. And I would say that's one of the like deep, deep, deep things. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing I would say is that people were really good about teaching me, training me up in the art of kind of getting people to the most important point. We get out into the field, and there are 20 different directions you could go down. There are rabbit holes that you could go down that could completely take people off target. And I think indirectly or directly, they were really big about, hey, this is the critical piece of information we've got to drive home for people. This is out of everything in the visit today. This is the thing you want to make sure that they understand. Even though we could go down 20 other things, and that's become a really big one for me. So I may be in the field a little bit prone to all the different things we could possibly discuss, or maybe even I could point out a disagreement with you on. I might actually just set those aside because there's a most important thing to get accomplished for the day. And I'm going to kind of hone in on that and really drive that point home.
That's a good point to make. Matt, do you think there's too much information out there?
I don't think there's ever too much information. I mean, that we need a good batch of information to make decisions off of. I think there's a sifting problem. Sifting through information is a big deal. And then I think we live in a really complicated world where it's hard to determine the reliability of information. Is this really solid material? Or is this material that's maybe a few shades less than solid? And I think it's really important. Yeah, I think that's where an agronomist comes into play. Actually, I think that's one of the things I hope that a certified crop advisor does, is that they help people sift through the mountain of information and point out, yeah, this, you can really rely on this right here. And the other thing is that we serve as a standard, to kind of gauge what's reliable, what's trustworthy or not. Again, and not kind of talking any other person's batch of information down. You just want to make sure that you have some resources in the field where people can cut through it all and get to the stuff that's probably most solid so they can make those wise investments, because we just don't have a lot of room for error in the industry right now.
Yeah. Uh, s- Speaking on the farmer's behalf, how do they sift through information, or how do they make sure it's substantial? You say working with an agronomist, which I think is great, but if I see a farmer that's sifting through a magazine or
Yeah.
something, or they're looking at research, what advice do you have for them on how they should question maybe what that information is, and making sure it is reliable?
Yeah, great question. And boy, I wish I had some old articles that I'd written on this right in front of me, because I'm going to miss some of those important points. But I think one thing that's really important as you're looking through information, is try to figure out, is this is the study very detailed out? Does it really discuss the things that happen in the study? Does it look like the results occurred over a variety of locations, right? Rather than just one study that somebody's going with. I think even though sometimes we can beat up on university extension systems just a little bit, if you find something associated with the university extension system, that's a reliable piece of information. So if you find um, if you find kind of an article or something that looks interesting, sometimes a nice second thing to do is, I'm going to go see if extension has said anything about that, or if some of the major agricultural companies have had something to say along that. Right? There are some people that I think of as being big leaders in the industry, and I'll kind of see, have they had anything to say about this topic? And then I kind of know that, okay, I had this bit of information, and now this real trusted source has something to say on that point too. And the other thing is, don't underestimate the power of the smell test. if something smells off, yeah, listen to your gut on that just a little bit. If it sounds too good to be true, we live in an environment where we want, sometimes we need the Hail Mary pass to make everything work out, but be real conscious of that and don't kind of lull yourself into complacency to buy into something that you want to be true because it's going to help out stuff a little bit. If it smells off, if it sounds too good to be true, there's a lot of times a lot of reason to think it is too good to be true.
Sure. Listen to
Yeah.
your gut. And
Yeah.
I will say, if you go out and you don't find anything on extension maybe for it, that is a good time to call up your CCA or agronomist and get their take on it.
And I would also say, and I should make sure I'm saying this as a soy envoy, that look at organizations like Illinois Soybean Association, right? They've put together a really good team, a really good agronomic team, and they can become a nice baseline to gauge stuff off of. And I think also, look around at people that you really respect, even if they're competitors. But look around at people that you really respect, other growers. I think a lot of growers honestly make their decisions based off of what other growers are doing, and that's part of the secret of education too, is to get to key players and make sure you talk to them, because other people are going to look at them and make their decisions based off of those people. But look at those people and see what they're doing. Don't be afraid. Honestly, I remember some questions I've had people ask me in the past about investments, and I would turn around and point at seed corn growers and say, okay, look, they're not doing that. That's a really high value crop, and they're not engaging in that practice. So, some of those, if you have a relationship with those people who are kind of involved in the production of that critical high value crop, you can use that as a gauge as well. I'm not sure if all of that makes sense. I think I'd probably be able to outline it a little bit better for you, but that's kind of the general idea.
Sounds like a good blog post.
Yeah, that's great. I got my first blog post idea. I love that. That's good.
There you go. I I think it's so fascinating, this world of information, and as a
Yeah.
journalist myself, it's so important to verify. Verify,
Yep.
verify. There's, like you said, I agree with you. I don't think there's too much information out there, but you have to sift through what's
Yeah.
you can verify and what is maybe just so off-putting that you're like, What happened here?" But then also, if you see research, do some on your own farm. And I've talked
Yeah.
with soy envoys about doing that. Um, it does maybe sound sometimes too complicated, but if you're really interested in something, don't start with the whole farm. They
Yeah.
say that before too. Start with a chunk, and be a learner, and see and see if that practice is for your operation. But start small, I guess, is
Yeah.
what I'm saying, if you're really interested in it.
There are two things I also should mention. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention those here. One thing would be, don't forget that the foundations matter, right? There are some foundational things we have to do to produce a crop. I mean, you know what those are, right? Honestly, if you've been doing the raising of a crop for a while, you know what that is. You know the kind of fertilizer you have to use. You know what you have to do for weed control. You know what you're having to do as far as investment in seed. Just foundational stuff. You have to get set. And if a piece of information is trying to tell you, you don't have to worry about getting those foundations pinned down right, I would take that and set that aside and go somewhere else. And then the other thing I should mention, because of this crazy new world that we live in, I would dig deeper than what the AI response has to say when you do a search. Because even though AI is really good, they'll call it hallucinations. It can sometimes, it's almost like AI almost seems to me like it's got a really big ego. It has to come up with an answer, and sometimes it'll spit out some crazy stuff that's not right. A lot of the times it's solid, and yeah, it can be the first hint that, yeah, this is a good piece of information. But I would sure dig
Sure.
deeper than that, and not just go AI level deep. I'd go deeper than that, because sometimes it can be off and off in big ways.
Real quick, Matt, in case I think it's always good to return to the basics. What are some of those basics things just to remind a farmer? I know one of them that comes up is making sure your soil pH is in an adequate range. I mean,
It's
something so simple and so basic, but it's also good reminders.
that's like a core one. I mean, that whole soil pH thing. I can run all over the place and make all sorts of investments, but if I'm not making sure pH is right, those investments don't matter. That's something you have to get done right because it influences the whole spectrum of everything else that you're going to run into soil fertility wise out in the field. The P and K investments. We know that potash, right, is a big investment when it comes to beans. You know, wow. I mean, in some cases, potash uptake can sometimes rival, kind of nitrogen demands in some crops. So, I mean, that's a big one. I think, there's that investment in making sure that we're getting enough seeds out there. I know there's a lot of arguments about what that ideal range is. What I would say is, if it sounds really, really low and you're thinking, boy, that's going to let me get by without a lot of investment, be careful. And if you're thinking, boy, I'm going to just put in what dad did, 25, 30 years ago, that's probably on the extreme end too. There's a nice place, a Goldilocks area down the middle that's a lot better for you to operate in. Quality seed, making sure you have good seed treatments. And frankly, a foundational thing you are never going to get away from having to, unless you're an organic program, you are never going to get away in most of this thing from having a really high investment when it comes to weed management. We can't walk away from that. That's just going to happen. Those are some of the foundational things that I can think about. You're going to have to start clean and keep it clean, and you're going to have to do things to keep that yield potential, as much of that yield potential, intact as the season goes along. And if you aren't doing those core things, if you're bypassing those core things and trying to leap 3 or 4 steps ahead to other possible investments, you need to pause, go back to that foundational stuff and do that stuff. Then think about
Yeah.
moving on to the next step.
Yeah. Great advice. Matt, I want to ask you about soybeans as nematode because one of the biggest yield,
Yeah.
they call it the silent killer of
Yeah.
yields in soybeans. And I feel like, it comes up in conversation, then it dips back down. And what are you seeing and how to manage that pest? I know we have the different genetics and things, but those are getting resistance too.
Yeah.
So how are we dealing with that?
So I think one thing to be conscious of is that I think you're right. It has SC and has fallen off the radar for some people. I think more because there have been seasons where we've talked about that kind of left and right, right? To the point that then we think we've exhausted it. We need to find some other things to talk about. Um, I go out and we, uh, you can find some pretty high cyst nematode counts. I can think of past experience, some counts that just blew me away. I still tend to think about cyst counts, right? Rather than egg counts, because that's the world I grew up in. But like, I can think about a field where I saw 40 cysts on 100 cc's of soil. That's an
Mhm.
insane level of cyst nematode pressure. And we used to talk a lot about you won't see above ground symptoms in season. And if we hit a little bit of a dry spell, I can find above ground symptoms that look like potash deficiency that oftentimes are cyst nematode. Those are happening a little bit more. And, you know, I, you know, 30 years ago, we were doing surveys where we thought, maybe 75% of fields had infestations of cyst. That number has not got any better over time. And so I think number one, be really aware that it is the big yield reducer. Number two, we are getting into an environment where we have some of those other genetics that are available. I think the caution point there, so Peking is the big one, right? That's coming into play. People are going to have to remember that's not a run to. Everybody abandoned the old source of resistance, PI 88 788, and let's just run in mass over to Peking because we will tank Peking if we do that. We're going to have to
Mhm.
we're going to have to rotate between those two. We're going to have to rotate to non-host crops, which we do. And then we're also going to make sure, I think we're going to want to make sure that we're tapping seed treatments, because while they may not be perfect cyst nematode management tools, they may be better at kind of early season taming down. It's at least a way to throw one more hurdle at that thing. And again, I think we're going to be have to be real conscious of resistance management on that pest, because some of these fields where you're seeing some pretty high cyst counts, those people have been using resistant beans and they've been rotating. And yet I'm still seeing these really high cyst counts. And that's probably a bad sign for us
Yeah,
about
I
where
was
we
gonna
are
say
in
what
that
happens
battle.
next. Yeah,
That's
what
right.
happens next when those options don't work?
That's right. Luckily, like I said, there's some alternate sources of resistance. There's some other things coming along in the industry that will be announced here, in the future and be released in the future. And those are great things. That's going to help us out a ton. But I think if we ever just remember kind of what happened with Roundup and translate that into the rest of management and tell yourself that's not what we want to do with anything else.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Matt, on the agronomy side, anything else you want to leave our farmer listeners with across the spectrum?
You were talking about my logo earlier on, and there's a little tagline down at the bottom of that. And the tagline is live the golden and silver rule of ag. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes we forget those two rules. And golden rule is you do to others as you want done to you. That's a good way to live. That's also a good way to farm, right? That you want to be a good neighbor to the people next to you. You want what you do to, as much as possible, remain on your acres and not go somewhere else. And then the other thing is the silver rule, what I call the silver rule of ag, and that is to hand it off better than we received it. And I think it's really important to remember that this long-term game that we're in that we call farming, which is more than a game. I'm just using some metaphors here. But this long-term thing that we're in called farming, it stretches beyond us. And we really want to hand that off to the generations that come after us better. And we want those two philosophies to be instilled like heart deep, like deep down into the soul, into the generations that come after us. And that can sound pie in the sky. That's fine. I get that. But I do think the industry and the world's a better place when we live by those two precepts. And I'm trying to remind myself of that every day.
Yeah, definitely. Because we need this industry for
Yeah.
years and years and years and years to come. So it's always a great reminder. And as we live in this political environment too, where we debate practices, we talk about
Yeah.
conservation, um, just think of how things have changed in the
Yeah.
past 50 to 100 years and where that might lead into the future, hopefully for the better.
Yeah. Yeah. I think every grower I've ever visited with, if you dig down deep, they really, they really want to make sure this is something that they hand off to those that come after them. Nobody wants to screw this thing up. But
Yeah,
in every decision
for
that
sure.
we make, just remember that those are the two big things. You want to do right by other people, and you want to hand it off better. And keep kind
Yeah.
of circling back to those, and those can guide you pretty well in life and in farming as well.
Matt, I just have one more question,
Yeah,
agronomy related, before I get to my rapid
sure.
fire round of
I'm
next
scared.
questions.
There's a
What's
rapid fire
what's
round. I'm worried now.
everyone's so worried about the rapid fire. I'm like, these are such basic questions, but I'm like, I love hearing the answers. But before I get to that, what is the one thing you're educating on to your agronomist right now, Bex? Like, what's
Mm.
the hot topic?
Yeah, the hot topic. Well, I'm 5 months into the position, and so that's a little bit it's a little bit hard to figure out what that one topic is. But I would say that probably the big one that I've been talking about a lot is red crown rot, which is kind of a near and dear topic to me because I worked in that Western Illinois area, which is kind of one of two epicenters in the state for that disease, and that one is probably the one I've talked about and spent a lot of time on here over the last 5 months.
Do you think, Because I'm in the world of it. I've been hearing much more of
Yeah.
it from the past 2 years. Do you think we need to be more concerned about it, or is it too much?
Um, so I think it comes back to that education topic again. It is the right thing to educate people about how yield reducing this disease is. It's pretty staggering. 40 to 60% losses where it's really got its roots in the ground, where it's really embedded itself in the countryside. And that needs to be respected. I think then the other side of it is that we need to make sure that we call it right, and we don't make it sound like the sky is falling everywhere at this moment, right? We need to make sure we're telling people about it. And you want to know about this when it does come to your part of the world, and you want to be able to identify it so we can track where it is. But I don't want you to panic. It's kind of Kelsey,
Yeah.
it's the same thing that we always do in this industry. You want to raise people's awareness without creating unreasonable panic, and that's this tension that
That's
we're
what I
always
was
in.
getting at, yeah.
Yeah, it's this tension we're always in, and sometimes I soar at that job and sometimes I crash and burn. And so I'm trying to make sure that I maintain that tension, that hey, you need to understand and respect this thing. This is a yield reducer that's probably unlike some things you've seen before, but don't automatically think that it's in your neck of the woods. And please, don't automatically say everything is red crown rot, right? We want to get the
Yeah.
identification right, so that when it really does land, people are aware and they take notice and they trust the information that's coming to them. We don't want to get this wrong so that we kind of lull people into ignoring the problem, and then all of a sudden they get hit with some of these hefty yield losses.
What should growers be looking for then if they're scouting out in their fields and they see something's just not right?
Yeah, the best way I've kind of described it is this is not a windshield disease, but when you're driving by, if you see stuff that kind of looks like a yellow green dead mess, intertangled mess in the field, or a yellow spot out in the field, it's worth stopping and walking out always, right? Just to figure out what is that, what's going on out here. That's one of the things you and I talked about, I think, in some emails here the other day was, it's get a notebook, go out and scout and stop. That's the way you're going to do this bean production thing really well. You're going to go out, you're going to look for stuff that looks kind of like sudden death syndrome, so yellowing and dead between the veins. But again, it's going to be an intertangled mess. There are going to be some plants that are dead, and they're going to have the leaves still attached. There are going to be some healthy plants, and there are going to be these SDS like symptoms. And then you're going to get down on your hands and knees. And this is going to be more like late July into early August, maybe into mid August time period. And you're going to look down on the ground, inch above below the soil line, and look for those little red fruiting structures that we call perithecia. They look like little pinhead sized structures, little tiny spheres. There's nothing else that looks like them. You see little round things, sphere things, reddish in color down on the base of that plant, just underground. You dig up a bunch of plants and look at those, you find those, and that's how you're going to know that it's in that part of the world.
And that's something to look for. So,
Yeah.
and like you said, identify. So, I know we've worked with USDA ARS in the past on identifying. So, really identify before you exclaim, because it could be another
Yeah.
disease as well. So, that's
Boy,
really
we've had a
important.
string of other things kind of pop up late season here recently, right?
Yeah.
Diaporthe, right? Charcoal rot, some late season Phytophthora. We want to get it identified right. And the convenient thing is with this disease, it produces some structures that help you kind of get infield diagnosis done right. So,
Right. Right. All right, Matt, you ready for rapid fire?
okay. And then if I'm off, I'll fake like I'm going through a tunnel or something like that, Kelsey. I'll do some static on this end or something like
Yeah. Yeah. No drum roll needed. Just interesting question. So, my
that. Okay.
first question is from your career experience, what advice has stand out to you the most that you were given by someone?
I go back to that comment from Bill Brink. I know that doesn't sound like an agronomy answer, but I do think it's we talked about tension earlier. It's an important tension answer. Um, that this business matters and family matters too, and keep your eye on both. They aren't mutually exclusive. So that's one thing.
Mhm.
Um, I I don't remember who would have got me to do this, but the other thing I would say that's a little bit more agronomy is always dig, always dig, always dig. You see an issue out in the field, get your spade out. I don't care if you even think you know what it is. Dig up the plant because you only see one half of the story when you're not looking at roots. And that's true in beans. It's not just true in corn. And so every time you see something, dig up plants and look. Make sure you do that.
Great advice. Okay, next question. You've seen this industry, specifically agronomy, change. What's the one shift that excited you the most that you're like, yes, we're on track?
The one shift that, oh yeah. So here's my one thing. Yeah, great question. The thing that I feel the best about that I've seen happen is I was kind of around for the advent of fungicide use, around that 2004, 2005 period when it really began to take off. And we were using single mode of action products and lots of concern, for instance, that strobe fungicides, we'd overuse those, do the same thing that we did to glyphosate. I am really excited to see how much more combo product approach we use in the industry now. We're doing that with seed treatments. When you look at seed treatments from companies, more often than not, it's not true for everybody, but more often than not, it's multiple active ingredients, mode of action, site of action being targeted towards a pest. That is a good day. I see us doing that on seed treatments. I see us doing that on fungicides. I see us being more conscious of that on the herbicide front, and that's mission critical. We've got to make sure that we're throwing multiple modes of action out in season because our toolbox, uh, my old phrase is, Kelsey, the last new mode of action in agriculture were the bleachers, and I was in high school, which is
Ooh,
getting pretty far back now. I'd be on the order of 37 years ago, maybe
yeah.
38.
And as I've been learning from our government relations team at Illinois Soybean Association, a lot of regulations with the Endangered Species Act and everything
Yeah,
that's coming down the pipeline. So people are like, well, that doesn't affect me now. But I'm like, no, but it could affect you when new products have to be labeled or
it's-
re-registered. And I'm like,
absolutely.
you got to be prepared for it at
Yeah,
least.
we lose products through two pathways, resistance and regulation, and both are kind of a limited pool. The more often you use a product, the more often you run into potential regulation, the more often you run into potential resistance, and it's almost impossible to recover from both. And so we kind of live in an industry where we need as many tools as possible in the toolbox. And so we want to be
Yeah.
a good steward of that with how we use those products, so that we maintain good public will and we maintain viability out in the field.
Yeah. Okay, Matt, my next question. What's something you learned from a farmer? So maybe not another agronomist, but a farmer that you still use today. It could be a practice, it could be a lesson.
Yeah. Um, Staying calm. I think about being out in a what I considered a real dire situation with my father-in-law, and one that I was absolutely freaked out about, and just watching how steady he was, and we'll work our way through this. It'll be okay. And probably two things I figured at that point was that it's probably better for me to be an agronomist than to be the farmer because I was going to freak out. Um, but the other thing was, as I stepped out in the field, learn to be calm like that. Keep your head about you, so that you can really think through the problem. And that was a really important lesson.
It's a great lesson. Is there one app or piece of tech that you use or rely on daily that you'd recommend to others?
Oh man. Um, so that I would recommend to others, one piece
Usually
of
it has something to do
tech.
with weather.
Yeah, well,
Everyone
yeah.
has
I
a good
mean,
weather app.
yeah, like Weather Underground, I'm always checking left and right. So I guess that's a quick answer. As far as a piece of tech that I rely on all the time, I'm not sure I'm recommending it to other people, but I mentioned I do a lot of drawings to kind of educate. And actually, I use PowerPoint all the time for that. So I draw
Mm,
all my stuff off of PowerPoint. I'm not sure that's a recommendation for people to do that, but yeah,
it's a
I
good
think
behind the scenes. It's
yeah,
working
yeah,
for
it's a
me.
good behind the scenes thing. That honestly, I'm not sure it's a piece of tech anymore. I think it's more standard practice. But drones, holy smokes, that has been a life changing tool. And I've used that tool a lot over the last few years, more than I ever dreamed possible. And 10 years ago, I would have told you no way that that would ever really be a player. And yet
Yeah.
it's a player in a whole bunch of different ways. Yeah.
Just think of what we'll be seeing with drones and the
Oh my.
swarms that they're talking about
Yeah. Yeah.
in the next 5 years, probably.
I, I think people, even on the spray side are beginning to respect drones more than I ever thought possible. I heard somebody said to me the other day, "Man, no tracks in my field." That was a big win for
Mm,
me. That was that's what they said to me. That was a big win. I don't have any tracks in the field from having done that. And that's a pretty interesting take.
it is. It is. Okay, Matt, if you were in your current job, which I know you really enjoy, what do you think you'd be doing?
Oh, wow. What would I do if I wasn't in this current job?
These aren't really rapid fire questions. I'm really getting you to think.
Yeah, you are. You are. This is great. If I hadn't gone down this road, maybe what would I have done? I suppose there was a day and age where if I hadn't done this, I kind of thought that ministry would have been a neat thing to do. And but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm cut out for that or not. So yeah, I suppose there was a time I kind of thought about something like that
Oh,
if I
that's
didn't
so
do this.
interesting.
Yeah.
Never too late. I tell people to do
Uh,
not to like
that's-
I mean this day and age when you can just do so much than just your one job, but that's a lot of work to do
yeah, I
more than
think
one
I'm in
thing.
where I'm at right now. I'm 50, gonna be 53, and so I think this is it. I think this is the gig, and I'm gonna enjoy every minute of it to the end. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Okay, Matt, my last question besides my very last question. So I guess
my
my
my kind of last
second to
question.
last question. What do you wish someone would have told you before going into this role or going into this industry? Like, if you talk about mentoring younger people, what do
Hmm.
you tell them before entering a job, such as being an agronomist, certified crop advisor?
Yeah, I think how much people skills matter in this role. Um, I talked about I there will be a nugget of truth. I think is the most important thing to get across to a person, and part of that, part of what you have to do there is look at truth as a promised land that you want other people to get to with you. And that means you have to have this skill set for how you wisely present something so that they'll come along with you and understand where you're trying, the better place you're trying to get them to. And that really does require people skills. If you're terrible at people skills, you're going to mess that thing up and you'll never get them to that point with you. And it's not a win if you don't get them to that better spot with you. And so really
Mhm.
really good people skills and how you communicate with people and show them that you respect them. Even if you're on completely disagreeing on something, show them that you respect them and that you really do honor, the work that they do, and find a way in that to kind of walk with them to this other spot that you think is really
Yeah.
important for them to understand.
And you gain that trust to be a trusted advisor and
Exactly.
know that I've learned recently you don't always want to agree with someone because then y- y- you have to have that partnership of having a discussion and coming on the other
Yeah,
end of it, seeing which is truly, you can't always be a yes person. You have to be like, no, here's where I disagree with you, and have a mutual respectful
that's
discussion.
right.
That's
That's
key.
right. I think that's exactly right. You have to go. I think what I maybe I appreciate more and more. Every person we value with has value already. Every person we visit with has value already. And if you can approach those people and you can kind of just show that in the way that you interact with them, that goes a long way to walking through those touchy situations. You'll recognize they already have value, and
Hmm.
they can feel that. That's really important. That's not manipulation. You got to really believe that down in your core, that these people are valuable, important. They have value beyond what I'll ever offer, and I need to respect them.
Okay, Matt, anything we did not cover today? We covered a lot of good
Wow.
things.
I think I talked your leg off, and I'll apologize for that. Agronomists have a really bad habit of not giving short answers, and that is
No, it
probably.
always starts with "it depends,"
And I
but
always
it
say
does.
that it does, yeah. And I always say that an agronomist, a time on the agenda is a suggestion for an agronomist, right? We don't think it's real. Oh, they kind of meant it should be that. I'll push it longer.
Yeah, for
No,
sure.
I think again, just be very conscious to do the kind of management things that are the must do's, to make sure that you really can hand this thing off better. Be very careful not to get yourself into a situation where you need a Hail Mary pass to make this thing work. Do the critical management things up front, even when they're hard and costly, because they do have long-term benefit. Remember, this is a long-term game. Maybe that's a
Hmm.
little thing that I would lay out on the table.
I think that's a great way to end it. Matt Montgomery with Beck's Hybrids. Thanks for joining us today.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor Podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor Podcast on your favorite podcast platform.